Looking at maps throughout history can reveal some almost unbelievable patterns, like an empire that stayed extremely wealthy more than 1,000 years after its collapse, or an election that was decided before humans roamed the earth. Have a look at this. What do you think is the connection between Cretaceous sediments from 66 million years ago and Alabama election results in 2020? Well, those sediments turned into highly fertile soil. Highly fertile soil made for more productive farms. Productive farms back in the 1800s could afford more black slaves, which means this corridor has a larger black population, who in turn vote more favorably for Democrats. Having a good understanding of history means having a good understanding of everything that shapes history: economics, geography, culture, and, yes, as disgusting as it is, sometimes even politics. Speaking of culture, I want to give credit to the person who first assembled this collection of maps, a Reddit user by the name of, I am Sharticus. Oh, that's fucking great. Anyway, good historians often need to look beyond the exciting tales of epic battles and coordinate with these other fields to get a more complete picture of how history works. In return, history can be used to answer some of the world's biggest questions, and perhaps none of those are more important to humanity today than why some places are rich and some places are poor. The answer may lie in another striking pattern on a map spread out over 1,200 years. Here is a map of Charlemagne's empire at its height, and here is a regional breakdown of GDP per capita today in 2025. The borders are almost identical. So what did this Charlemagne fellow do to keep his empire rich so long after its collapse?
These days we see Charlemagne as the father of Europe.
At his death, Charlemagne ruled all of modern France, Belgium, Holland, nearly half of modern Germany and Austria-Hungary, more than half of Italy, and northeastern Spain. It's hard to exaggerate Charlemagne's impact on the course of Christian history in Europe.
When Charlemagne was crowned emperor on the 25th of December 800, he was at the peak of his power. He ruled a realm that encompassed almost the whole of Europe.
The first skill a good historian needs is being able to critically analyze data. And the golden rule of data analysis is that correlation doesn't equal causation. The simplest example is that sunscreen sales and forest fires are highly correlated, but sunscreen doesn't cause forest fires, and people don't put on sunscreen to fight fires. Well, they are correlated, but the one thing that causes them both is hotter summer weather. So before crowning Charlemagne the greatest long-term economic planner of all time, we should double-check there aren't some spurious variables here. Just because the Carolingian Empire's borders line up almost perfectly with the wealthiest regions of Europe today doesn't necessarily mean that Charlemagne caused that wealth. But that doesn't actually matter, because even if we find out what that third hidden variable could be, then we have still gained some insights into what makes places richer. So then what could have explained both the conquests of an ancient empire and the development of modern industry? A good place to start is geography. The natural composition of Western Europe is about one of the only things that has stayed somewhat consistent over that time. Charlemagne inherited an empire that had already been expanding its borders for over 2 centuries. From its homeland in what is today France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, the Franks expanded their borders down across Germany, Switzerland, and into northern Spain and Italy. These are all the places that are wealthy today, and one of the reasons for that might be their extensive network of waterways. The Rhine, Seine, Loire, and Rhone rivers today handle hundreds of billions of dollars worth of economic activity every single year. Inland waterways are basically a cheat code for industrial growth because they provide water to large populations, irrigate farmland to feed those populations, and serve as a cheap way to move heavy, bulky industrial products long distances with only basic riverboats. This happens all across the world. One of the USA's most strategically important geographic features are the Great Lakes and inland waterways that it uses to transport agricultural and industrial products incredibly cost-effectively. About 60% of US grain for export is shipped via barge down the Mississippi River alone, according to the US Department of Agriculture. In China, about half of all the country's economic activity takes place within 3 miles of the shores of the Yangtze River and its tributaries. But rivers are not only good for supporting highly productive populations, they are also good at supporting marauding armies. Men on the march also needed water and food, and instead of providing transportation, rivers during ancient military campaigns often presented significant roadblocks, as crossing them was really hard without making the army very vulnerable. Just ask PewDiePie. Anyway, rivers are still used as natural borders today, which is part of the reason why ancient empires and modern society can look so similar on a map. Now, this initial expansion of the Franks happened under the Merovingian dynasty, until they were deposed by Charlemagne's father, Pepin the Short, in 751. Marking the official start of the Carolingian dynasty. Like all new managers just starting out, they wanted to shake everything up to prove they were worthy of the top job, so Charlemagne the Great redoubled the empire's efforts to conquer territories. The reign of Charlemagne the Great wasn't actually so great for the average European at the time. His empire was almost constantly at war, with campaigns that eventually pushed his borders up against natural obstacles on every side. So what this means is that maybe this ancient empire just happened to expand the same way that industrial empires do today, rather than some centuries-long economic planning. Sunscreen and wildfires may be correlated, but sunscreen doesn't start fires. So, mystery solved, right? Well, no, there is still a lot more to this story. There were hundreds of ancient empires throughout the ages, expanding their territory across the geography that was presented to them, and none have been able to replicate this almost perfect pattern, especially not in such a short amount of time. There is more to this than just some non-causal correlation. So it's time to learn how history works, to find out what Charlemagne did to keep his people wealthy more than 1,000 years after his death. The extent of Charlemagne's empire kicked off what a lot of historians now call the First Renaissance, a full 400 years before the more famous Renaissance that you know from art, architecture, and Assassin's Creed. The Carolingian Renaissance brought about real economic development that made up for the ground lost during the fall and fragmentation of the Roman Empire. The widespread unification of Europe made things possible, which just couldn't be done with a group of isolated kingdoms and subsistence farmers. In his book, The Carolingian Economy, the historian Adrian Verlust notes that the expansion of this empire allowed for the development of codependent cities that could specialize in certain artisanal production and then rely on trade with other areas to feed themselves. The trading city of Dorstad in modern-day Netherlands moved salt, wine, grain, fish, and crafted goods between other townships within the empire, as well as across the sea into modern Scandinavia and Britain. Before reliable trade, local lords and townships had to focus on making sure they had enough food to eat first and foremost, so the capacity to specialize beyond agriculture was extremely limited. Estates also became much larger in the empire, which meant instead of just toiling fields to support themselves, farms could support themselves plus a significant amount of additional labour, which could then afford to focus on making other stuff to go and trade with. The lesson of trade, commerce, and economies of scale were clearly not forgotten, as these market cities remained long after the empire itself collapsed, and acted as a springboard for colonial expansion, trading goods across the world instead of just across Europe. Now, fair warning, a lot of this trade was also not particularly savoury. One of the empire's biggest exports were slaves from conquered lands. These people weren't put to work within the empire themselves, but were instead exported to Arabia and Muslim Spain, because at that time, these lands had a policy of not enslaving people of their own religion, which was nice for them, I guess. This trade, as barbaric as it was, once again opened up connections to the east, which allowed for the flow of silk, spices, medicines, and knowledge from across the known world. The trade was so lucrative that many historians argue that it effectively bankrolled the empire, funding the achievements that tend to get a bit more attention in the history books. Now, over time, this simultaneously made the areas within the empire richer, and the land just beyond its borders poorer, as they lost their working populations. It's unlikely that this directly impacted the economy in the modern day, but it did introduce a cultural taste for exploiting conquered populations. The victors in Western Europe learned from the spoils, and the victims in Eastern Europe learned from devastation, which means the former was much happier to do it in the future and enjoy the wealth that came from colonialism. Now, if there was a silver lining, it's that a lot of this wealth was, at the very least, put towards a worthy cause: education. After the collapse of the Roman Empire, Latin literacy rates dropped significantly, and worse still, the regional kingdoms that developed in the vacuum had started to develop their own dialects that were becoming unintelligible to one another. Communicating across vast ancient empires was hard enough when the fastest way to get a message around was a man on a horse. But ruling over people who couldn't communicate with one another made that problem all the more difficult. To fix this, Charlemagne created the Charter of Modern Thought, which was a public declaration that the people were getting too stupid and that it needed to be fixed. The empire constructed schools and brought in scholars from across the world to teach noblemen and the clergy how to read and write, so that the voice of the empire could be adequately transmitted. The language of the empire did eventually break apart into the various Romansh languages still used in Western Europe today. But this effort did introduce medieval Latin, which wasn't used by commoners but was used by the church and rulers across Europe for hundreds of years. For example, the 1215 Magna Carta, the document that recognized that even the king was not above the law, was written in this version of Latin. So education, trade, commerce, and a good helping of geographic selection bias are some of the reasons why these two maps line up so well. But there is one other skill that a good historian needs that's more important than basically anything else. If you develop a hypothesis, you need to be able to try and disprove it before it's recognized as a theory. Charlemagne's empire spread out over a territory that ended up being very wealthy in the modern day. But there are other regions just beyond its borders that have done just as well, if not better. Modern Denmark is wealthier than everywhere else on this map, besides Monaco, Luxembourg, and Switzerland. No guesses for figuring out why. And yet it was never conquered by Charlemagne. In fact, the empire had to sue for peace with them because back then, the laid-back Danes had a real taste for Viking raids. Norway, the UK, and Ireland were also within reach and are also doing just fine today without the stamp of Charlemagne. So while the empire clearly did some things right, there are certainly a lot more other variables that make rich countries rich. Even colonialism, that would go on to define the economy of this region in the centuries that followed, was by no means a guarantee of economic success. In fact, most of this money never made it back to these countries themselves. Corruption, embezzlement, and early corporate finance made sure that nobody made any money, but everybody got paid. Go and watch this video next to find out just how unhinged the first international corporations truly got. And don't forget to like and subscribe to keep learning how history works.